to start by welcoming everybody to the PRCA Global Series, and it's a series featuring global experts and the market spotlights tailored for our members around the world. So I'm Jo Brophy, you've seen me before, and I'm delighted to host today's spotlight session. So today I'm joined from a panel from across the UK to discuss how to navigate the UK market from working with a PR agency on the ground or expanding your own agency into the UK. So as always, it's an interactive session, so feel free to use the Q&A box, and we'll get to all of the questions throughout the session, but we've also made some time at the end to answer any questions we don't get round to. So as you can see, I'm joined by a lovely panel. So we have Amelia Stevens, and she is based in Cardiff. We have Richard Stone, based in Stafford. We have Josh Wheeler, based in Manchester, and Danny Whatmough, based in London. So thank you everybody for joining me. And Amelia, I'm going to start with you. If you can start us off by introducing yourself.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Jo. Hi, everybody. My name's Amelia Stevens. I'm the MD of For Cymru, who is part of For Agency Worldwide. So we are a big independent agency with offices based in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Riyadh, Sheffield, London, Aberystwyth and Cardiff, where I'm based. So I head up the Welsh division, and we work quite a lot in the education, healthcare space, public sector, food and drink, predominantly just in Wales. And I'll hand over to Richard.
Thanks. I'm Richard Stone. I'm the founder of an agency called Stone Junction. We're a specialist science, technology and engineering agency, and we've been around for probably somewhere in the region of 15, 16 years now, I think. I've been doing this this lovely thing we call PR for about 25 years now. And prior to that, I was at a couple of agencies based in London, one called Lewis, one called Houston. And sometime around 2010, I took the brave move of stepping away from London and moving to Stafford, which for all of those of you outside the United Kingdom is somewhere between Birmingham and Manchester, both of which are north of London. I'm really looking forward to today. Danny.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. So my name is Danny Whatmough. I'm MD of an agency called Red Consultancy. We're based here in the heart of London in Soho. We're about 130 people. Our background is mainly working with consumer brands, but we kind of do that across a whole range of sort of different kind of sectors as well. My background is I sort of started my career in digital, so in-house kind of digital roles, but I've done that for the last kind of 20 years or so within PR agency settings. So I guess firstly as the kind of digital person in the room, but increasingly in a kind of more integrated kind of mindset, bringing more traditional kind of PR and media relations alongside some of the more kind of social and digital kind of work that we do. I guess my experience working in more international settings, the first agency that I worked for was more in the sort of B2B IT sector. And we spent a lot of time, working with brands out of the US, but also a lot from the Middle East and helping them come and craft a message for a UK audience. And actually in my current role, I work with a number of brands from Asia, Chinese tech brands, Japanese brands as well, doing a very kind of similar job as well. And before I was at Red, I spent about 7 years at various networked agencies, Ketchum and Weber Shandwick, amongst two of them. And there, again, a lot of work working with teams from across our offices around the world and sort of crafting campaigns that would work from a sort of global perspective, but that would also have kind of in-market relevance as well. And I'll pass over to Josh.
Hi everyone, I'm Josh. I am the founder of B Broadcast, which is probably the youngest agency here. We started in 2022, the beginning of 2022. My background, at the very beginning of my career, I worked for the Economist Intelligence Unit, and the key element of that was placing analysts and experts on every possible subject you can imagine. The Economist can cover pretty much anything. Age 21, understanding and having the detail on what gold prices meant to the global economy was not necessarily my forte, but I got a feel for exactly how news moved so quickly. Over time, I joined up with a number of kind of broadcast specialist agencies working with brands, organizations, charities, independents, in order to both reactively and proactively position organizations across TV, radio, online, and social. During the pandemic, obviously, we didn't have much to do other than stay at home and watch TV and listen to the radio. So actually, our workload, I would probably say, quadrupled during that period, delivering some really difficult messaging, things like what you can do at a funeral, when we were literally advising people and helping people to understand how they could, say their final farewell to their loved one. And actually, at the end of that, I felt that I wanted to go off in a different direction and look at how we can use broadcast strategically, not necessarily just as a coverage generator, but strategically, and find different routes in. We have a number of different types of clients. I'd probably describe us as corpse humor, but where you are looking to speak to a person at the end of the day, someone who you want them to take some action, whether that's thinking, feeling, or doing, that's really where we come into it.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So I think we should start this panel discussion really on the hot topic of the day, and obviously that is AI. So Amelia, you're based in Wales. With AI, I wonder if you think that the Welsh language is being left behind.
Yeah, it's been quite a big topic of conversation in general, and actually when we're looking at it from a Welsh lens, and for anybody who's here and maybe not too familiar with Wales, we are our own country. We're, if you follow the football or the rugby, you might have more familiarity of who we are, but we're a really proud nation of about 3 million people, and we have our own language, Welsh. And actually, there's been a lot of conversations recently. Obviously, AI, generative AI learns the more that you use it and the more that you put into it. And less dominant languages, are sort of in fear of being left behind. So it's something that we have on our radar and feel quite passionate about at the moment. And Welsh Government, I saw, announced last week, actually, that they've just announced quite big investment into AI to ensure that the Welsh language doesn't get left behind. But it's definitely a concern for us, and we're doing everything that we can to use Welsh within the confines of the AI tools that we have in order to make sure that all the content that we generate in Welsh is being funneled in so that it can learn, hopefully, at an exponential speed, but, obviously not as dominant as other languages, when it forces you then into English, if you like, to get information or use the tools as effectively as possible. So yeah, it is a concern, but we're kind of just doing what we can within the remits and control parameters that we actually have.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to add any thoughts onto the AI conversation? Obviously, we have an audience that may not have English as their first language.
I mean, I think AI potentially with international working, and we talked a bit, talked about different languages and translation. I think AI offers lots of opportunities there. I think we're still at a point, certainly within the UK market, I think, where that always needs the kind of human filter across it. And I think I don't think journalists I think will spot AI speak very, very quickly. And so I think whether that's English language, whether it's Welsh, whether it's the other kind of dialects that we have in the UK, I think having a native speaker, making sure that they're casting an eye over press materials, all of those sorts of things, I think is really, really important. And Josh probably can speak to local spokespeople and things like that. But I think making sure that we've got that kind of human layer across everything we're creating, I think for this market in particular is still very vital, as I'm sure it is for other markets as well.
It's super interesting. You talk about local speakers. We're seeing that more and more come through, even just with UK brands. You know, the emphasis and the focus on things like case studies and voices that represent areas. However, interestingly, we'll come on to kind of media shifts. There's some other kind of tectonic plates that are pushing things around that are having an impact on that as well. What I think is really interesting is how close, and Amelia, Welsh is not my native tongue, so you may be able to help me here, but how close AI is getting to being solid at this. The thing that I think that is interesting, purely anecdotally, my sister-in-law is Swedish, and talking to her, you would believe she was American, because as she grew up, her diet of TV and media was kind of reruns from American TV shows, which has impacted the accent, dialect, words, phrases, etc. And I've noticed, you know, again, this is a move and a shift in terms of media traction, but I've noticed things like slips that are coming through, color, Zs included within articles. I wonder how long it will be before we actually start to see some of the kind of the Americanisms and the American English blurring into what we currently see. And that's English, and that's even before we get to Welsh, other kind of parts that are coming through. It's a really interesting area, purely from a language point of view.
Actually, what's quite interesting with that as well is we were talking earlier, weren't we, about even within like the UK, the West Country is very different to London, which is very, and each of the areas have their own kind of regional nuances as well, which can be completely lost a couple of counties over. I think we've got such an eclectic kind of, makeup in the UK as a whole, that can be quite interesting.
And I think there's a cultural shift in the UK, isn't there, also around, and this is the person sitting here in London, not everything coming from London and coming from the southeast. And I think whether that's, as I'm sure we'll talk about with the media relocating to other parts of the UK, making sure that regional dialects are present on TV, on radio, and all of those sorts of things. So I think it's very easy, I think, often for people, who aren't as familiar with the UK as a market to kind of focus a lot of attention on London. And it will obviously always continue to be that sort of magnetic draw. But I think to really kind of, especially for consumer brands, I think to really land authentically in this market, it is really important to think about the full, spectrum of the country as well.
I guess for the people watching this webinar who are sitting outside the UK, there's something quite hopeful about the Americanization of culture globally, isn't there? Because actually what we do as PR people is we try and build little connections with the people that we meet that allow us to influence them. And if you don't have any points of commonality with those people that you meet, then it's really difficult to build those little bridges, isn't it? But if you find yourself in a situation where actually you've grown up with 50% your own culture, Swedish in your case of your sister-in-law, Josh, and 50% American TV culture, well, in the United Kingdom, we've grown up with 50% our own culture and 50% American TV culture as well. So, there's a lovely episode of Friends where I think one of the characters says to, I think Ross says to Rachel something like, what have we got in common now? And she says, oh, we both like pizza or something like that. Well, what she's actually saying is that universally the world over, everyone pretty much likes pizza. So let's start with the very basics. Well, actually, universally the world over, pretty much everyone has seen Friends. Universally the world over, there are a series of social cues that we can take from American culture that most people know about. And that actually makes it a little bit easier to form those bonds, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think we've covered AI there. So then, Josh, I'll come to you. Are there any regulatory or legal considerations a PR professional outside of the UK should consider or needs to be aware of when entering the UK market?
So the short answer is yes. The long answer is there's quite a few. So in terms of things that you really need to consider, and this again is where having localities and agencies that can advise on this, is things around data protection, consumer rights, human rights, advertising standards, the rules and regulations when it comes to Ofcom and the Charter, and there's lots of different things to pick apart, right down through to the way that we're allowed to advertise food and talk about food and how that crosses over into editorial media. But if I kind of point towards the BBC, which I think is probably one of the if not the main media house across the country, the focus at the BBC is really on making sure that no brand is given undue prominence. Now, that looking at that from the very, very get-go might seem that actually there's no space for brands to be in there on a proactive basis. It might be about reactive news or challenges. And that's not the case. There are lots of different things that you can do, but you just have to make sure that you're adapting to the rules and the regulations that run with the BBC. So as a prime example, you're looking at things like independent voices, kind of bringing in elements that the BBC would naturally look for if they were looking to build a story or a piece of activity around what you're doing. Something that is credible, data proves kind of exactly the point that you're trying to get across, but that data has to meet the standards that are generally accepted within the media, and they evolve and they change over time. So staying kind of new to what those are is key. And then I think there's another bit in there around reflecting what life and society is like. So, just focusing on yourself as an organization doesn't necessarily cut the mustard. And in a sense, you need to be looking at how you interplay with people's lives, whether that's in a business sense, a consumer sense. But the old adage of inform, entertain, and advise is still very much true, but that now applies to you in that space. And I think when we look at that model and how that is reforming and reshaping the entire media landscape, I think it's something that I was weighing this up earlier. It's a real challenge that British brands here already are facing. They're struggling to gain that cut through, because the typical focus and the typical standard has been, this is what we're doing, this is what we think, and actually those kind of tectonic plates have shifted. We've seen changes at major media houses, cuts to places like Reach, that have been essentially driven by changes at the BBC. That model of how you approach TV and radio is now coming to how you approach pretty much all of online media. And certainly at the BBC, a journalist that would previously be looking after radio is now looking after TV, radio, social, and digital. So the platform has changed, and the other media houses haven't necessarily kept pace. But the opportunity, I think, for you coming fresh is you're not having to relearn, you're just having to start afresh.
I think as well, what's quite interesting to add to what Josh was saying is things, like Ofcom, the ASA and so forth, they are set, they're kind of, you have to adhere to those. But you've also got another layer with the United Kingdom being, 4 nations as well, which each have their own kind of different local laws at different levels. So if I take Wales, for instance, as a devolved nation, they're responsible for things like health and education and can set the parameters around that. So if you've got clients or brands that kind of want to connect with those sectors, then actually understanding that the control is sort of housed within Wales for those, not with UK government, can actually probably save you quite a lot of time and efficiencies in terms of, like, if you've got anything maybe in the policy side of things that you also want on your agenda. So it's just worth knowing and being aware as well of some of those kind of more fundamentals.
I came across a really, really cool campaign the other day. which was only in the very, very broadest sense a PR campaign. It was a marketing campaign. And it was a US campaign. And I think it illustrated for me some of the differences between marketing and PR outside the UK and trying to tackle the stuff that we do in our lovely tiny island kind of thing. And what they did in this campaign was it was by a hospital, and the hospital wanted to recruit more nurses. So they parked a van outside one of the other local hospitals. They obtained the contact details of all the people who logged onto the broadband of that local hospital. And when those people left, they sent them a message saying, would you like to come and work at our hospital? And then they did a PR campaign about how clever they were having done this, which they were. It was a really cool campaign, and it was incredibly effective. They filled all their jobs, and they had hundreds and hundreds of other applicants. Now, if you look at that in the United Kingdom, firstly, it would be illegal. So you wouldn't be allowed to do that at all. Next, on a cultural level, our healthcare system doesn't work like that. If you work within the NHS and you want to go and work in another hospital, you probably tell your manager, and your manager probably writes you a reference for you to go and work in that other hospital before you even make your application. And then on the third level, we'd probably see that as unethical as well. So your PR campaign afterwards to get you loads of coverage about how clever you've been wouldn't really work, because people would go, well, you know what, that's a little bit dodgy what you've done there. But in an environment where, firstly, it's legal to do, secondly, the healthcare system works in an entirely commercialized way, and actually it's fine to try and get nurses to go from one organization to another organization. And thirdly, in which both of those things being as it is, that kind of makes it an entirely ethical campaign. It creates a kind of a really interesting difference between us and what is done in other countries, doesn't it? And I think one of the things it does for me is it tells you that there are big things such as data protection laws, and there are small things such as the way we feel about our NHS in the United Kingdom that influence how you have to plan your campaigns.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Well, that really leads me on to the next question then. So when we're talking about preparing yourself to do PR in another country, you have so much experience between all of you. So what would you advise people? What do they really need to look at in advance, or before they even consider doing any kind of PR within the UK? And I'll come to you, Richard, first.
Okay, cool. I think that this is a little bit like the many other things that we do in different countries that are different depending on your location, that we have to learn and prepare for. So it's a little bit, for me, like learning to drive in another country when you go there on holiday, or when you travel, or when you relocate. So if you're trying to reach into the United Kingdom through PR, and you're doing it from a country where those people already speak English. So if you're reaching the United Kingdom from the United States, for instance, if you're reaching the United Kingdom from Australia or from South Africa as an English-speaking person in South Africa, you've got an advantage, because metaphorically speaking, that's a little bit like trying to learn to drive in a country where they also drive on the same kind of side of the road as you. So you're sort of halfway there. If you're doing it from a country where you have a language difference, then obviously you're learning to drive in a country where they drive on the opposite side of the road. So it's a little bit harder. But all of this stuff you can prepare yourself for. So I think for me, there's probably three things that you should start off by doing. So the first one is familiarizing yourself with the media landscape that you want to deal with. And for me, one of those key things is our attitude towards exclusivity in the United Kingdom compared to the attitude towards exclusivity that you find in other parts of the world. So many of the things that we think are fine in terms of sharing a story across multiple media outlets would be regarded as a kind of betrayal of trust in some other media markets. So what you kind of need to do is understand some of those differences. I think then probably the next thing is understanding culturally how we are different to other countries. And for me, one of the things that I've encountered most, which makes the United Kingdom different from nearly every other country in the world, is our attitude towards feedback, positive or negative feedback, and our understanding of what we mean when we say no or yes. So the first thing, the cultural feedback issue for me, is that many countries around the world, if someone is unhappy with something that you've done, they'll say, I think that thing's not very good, it's suboptimal, why don't we do it again? And the person that they're speaking to will feel entirely comfortable with that and not feel upset at all. If you say that to an English person or a British person without preparing them first and saying, you know what, my feedback style is very much more direct than you're going to be used to, they'll probably shrink inside themselves and die a little bit. And then it'll take quite a while for them to rebuild that trust with you. Similarly, in most other countries where the feedback methodology is much more direct, actually, when you've done something good, the person will say to you, you know what, you're fantastic at this. You're the best PR professional I've ever worked with, and I'm utterly delighted and honoured to work with you. And as English people, we probably quite like that, but actually we'll never say it back. We're just, we are much too, unable to communicate to ever possibly say something nice like that back. So you're welcome to say it, but don't expect us to say it back. And if we don't, it doesn't mean that we don't like you. And then I think the next thing is, our attitude towards what we mean when we say yes and no. So if you're pitching an article to a journalist in the UK, what might be a straightforward, no, thank you very much, I don't want it, but do come back with something else in the future, if you were pitching outside the UK, might in the UK be, well, I think there's stuff we could probably do to work with this. Maybe there are some changes that we could make. Yeah. So what you're actually getting is probably a no, but you might not hear it as a no. You might hear it as a yes. So there's that stuff to do. And then I think, the other thing for me is actually, it's kind of more about your confidence in when you do this stuff, right? So if you start off by learning 10 words in the language that you're planning to do your work in, okay, I know that most of the people who are pitching into the United Kingdom probably speak English because we have such a commonly spoken language, but if you were pitching into Wales, learn please, no, thank you, yes, hello, how are you first. That's 10 words in total. It won't necessarily get you very far with a person, but it will make you feel so much more confident and happy about it. And if you're working in a niche area, if you're working, I work only in engineering, only in science, only in technology, learn the words that actually relate to the technology or the science or the engineering that you're promoting, because that's going to make your life a lot easier. I think if you do those things, then it is a bit like learning to drive on the opposite side of the road. It is a little bit like learning to drive in another country, but actually, I think you'll probably find that at the very least, you're probably not Jensen Button or Michael Schumacher yet, but you're probably not going to go the wrong way around the roundabouts.
I love that analogy. Does anybody else have any?
I would add, I think all of those points are completely valid. Richard, I don't know about you. I always say to the people I'm working with that they're the best people that I've ever worked with. I said that's part of the course. I think though, what you're almost tapping into is around the relationship that you have with that journalist, and it's not to say that you need to be front and center. And kind of pressing the flesh. That's almost the job of your agency. But at the same time, I think there is probably something to be said for when you enter a market, meeting with media and getting a feel for what it is they're looking for. I remember quite early on in my career, I was working with someone who had come from the US, a major technological platform from the US to the UK, and couldn't understand why in the UK we weren't getting the same levels of coverage that she was seeing in the US. So in particular, this product was being used on the Ellen show daily. And that was seen as great PR results. It was a bit of a kick in the teeth in the fact that we looked after kind of global management as well. So eventually we actually took the clients, we were trying to explain, that kind of level of product promotion doesn't happen here. And we ended up taking them to meet the editor of the Mirror, where she was able to pitch some of the ideas and the thoughts that she had. The Mirror is a national newspaper here, to which he declined to her. And actually, as uncomfortable as that was, it was a very good learning to see, actually, look, this is how different those two media markets are. So my first piece of advice would be to try and get out there through your agency and just have coffees and lunch and just ask questions. It doesn't need to be an intro at that stage. Just ask questions and get a feel for what they're looking for.
I think just to add to that as well, Josh, I think also understanding when you should still keep trying yourselves to do it, because if you speak English, that, as a universal language, it can get you quite far, even in different countries that don't have English as a first language. There's some countries that I would almost say, actually, it's just better to acknowledge that you're not going to succeed as well as you would hope, and engage a local agency there. And one of those markets that we're working with, for instance, where we've seen this firsthand, is Japan, who is so different culturally to us, and things, what a press release over there is actually more what we would just call like a press announcement, for instance. And those kind of, if you accept those as well, then you'll be more effective in what you're trying to deliver. And again, to bring it back to Wales, we've got our own Welsh language broadcasters, broadcaster S4C, for instance, and, engaging with a Welsh language agency, for instance, will get you even further reach and coverage within the population of Wales by engaging them. And yes, I'm sure you can liaise in English, but it's more effective if you do it in Welsh.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And so you mentioned that the media world and the landscape there is changing so much. The digital world has changed so much alongside that. As well, just over the last 3 or 4 years. So Danny, I'll come to you. Can you advise anybody watching from outside of the UK what the preferred communication channels and platforms are for PR within the UK, and how that might have evolved over the past few years as well?
Yeah, and I think we are a quite advanced market and very complex, I think, actually, with a lot of that stuff. We have a complex media environment, as we've just been talking about, and there are lots of reasons for that, and despite the financial and commercial challenges that a lot of media owners find themselves in across the world, and the UK is no different, we still have a very, very big kind of media ecosystem. And I think the exact same is true when you then look at the kind of digital space as well. And, the kind of consumption of non-traditional media channels is as high in the UK as it is in any other market around the world. And so I think it is definitely worth having that in mind when you are thinking about the right approach to take in the UK. My advice, while I would love to be able to sit here and say, this is the channel you should tackle, the advice probably is very similar as you would in other markets, is to really try and interrogate the data and try and really be clear about who you are looking to target. And then, using an agency or using data you might have access to really try and understand where those audiences are, both geographically, but also in terms of the channels they're using, and the channels that they use to influence them around a certain kind of a certain topic or industry sector, depending on the kind of business you're running. So I think for a complex media market like the UK, I think having that strategic focus is is even more important, I think, than it potentially is in other markets. And if you don't do that, I think the real risk is you will burn through budget and resource incredibly quickly, because, you know, pull up a list of tech journalists in the UK if you're a tech business, and, you know, you will have a very, very long list, despite the fact that tech publications are closing left, right, and center. There's still a massive array, and that's before you've added in the YouTubers and the Instagrammers and the TikTok, et cetera. So I think being strategically focused is really key. I love the advice that's already been given around, you know, media meet and greets, because actually I think the media can still be a really great source of insight as well. And, you know, media will, especially, you know, a couple of years post-COVID now, they're always up for a coffee or a lunch. And actually those off the record chats can be incredibly useful. You know, many of the US companies that I've brought into the UK, they've really valued actually just sitting around a table with a journalist who's been in this game for years, and just, you know, getting their thoughts on, you know, what the market is like, you know, who are the brands they're hearing from, how best to approach them, all of those sorts of things. The same is true then when you look into the sort of the more digital and social space as well. You know, a lot of the work that we do currently for a lot of our consumer clients will be, you know, working closely with content creators or influencers or YouTubers to, you know, to craft pieces of content in a much more sort of collaborative way. So, you know, there are so many tools now in our arsenal as kind of modern comms professionals. The key to success in many markets, but in particular, I think for the UK, is finding the right one. And if you don't, then again, you risk trying to do so much, and ultimately you'll probably not get the results you need as a result.
If I could add to that an example, I couldn't agree more. I think there's sometimes a focus or a reliance on one specific area. So whether that's social, digital, whatever it is, there's often a temptation to just go down one route because that's our set specialism. And I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head perfectly, because one of the things that we talked about, that media shift, all of it is merging and mashing up together now. And I think you have to be thinking almost 2 steps ahead as to what is likely to happen as a result of the first action. So one thing that we did here, we work with a mental health charity, Calm, and we set up a series of challenges for Shirley Ballas, who is our Strictly Come Dancing, the dancing show here in the UK. She was taking on a skydive, a zip line, and some other things. I was very into it at the time. And actually, a key focus, knowing where the audience was, we were targeting places like BBC Breakfast. But then what else from BBC Breakfast? So we had digital paps that were signed up and ready outside of Key House to capture her leaving after the appearance. We'd set up an emotional heartstring moment where we got her mum. It was one of the most stressful things I've ever done, but we got her mum secretly up the country, hiding in the building to surprise her on air, all with the view of, there's our first audience on TV, but our second audience lives on social media. And we were really pushing for BBC Breakfast to put that piece onto X, Twitter, etc., and other channels, so that it drove donations, which is exactly what it did. So it's that multi-platform approach, but even to the extent of what's the next step that you're going to take with it. Don't think in isolation, because the media market is so fragmented now.
Actually, you've just sort of provoked a couple of thoughts there, actually, just what you said about targeting, you know, based on your audience. And I think looking at the different sort of generations and how they consume platforms, obviously we've got Generation Alpha who are coming through, Generation Beta is the one that haven't even been born yet, who are only going to know AI as a default. Life has always been, will have always been AI for them. And looking at the shifts in how like TV and broadcast media is consumed live versus catch up, and the news is one of the, you know, the kind of few, I guess, segments, if you like, that is more valuable being consumed in the live format than on catch up later, because it's almost then completely out of date, and how these are being sort of consumed as well. You know, a lot of households now just, you know, consume media digitally as well. and looking at kind of reach and frequency. You know, we've got tools that can deliver us that information as well. So if we're trying to target, you know, Gen Z, you know, they spend less time consuming TV in the usual fashion than, you know, over 50s, for instance. So actually kind of looking at, well, how much coverage, how often, you know, when do we need to kind of seed something out? Do we just need to go big and fast based on the timeliness of what's happening? Can actually provide some real insights and you know, extras kind of, again, like value and sort of efficiencies in terms of your time and effort, so that if you've just got a one shot with a, you know, an editor, you might just want to time that correctly on those channels to get the best impact.
Absolutely. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I totally agree with that. And I think, you know, there's a really interesting piece there also around you know, having your kind of ducks in a row, like, you know, making sure that, and you know, we are in a multi-channel world. So, you know, and I do this still in the morning, you know, we have still a print paper, commuter paper called the Metro that I get every day, like a good PR person, as I get my train into work in the morning. And I love playing that game where you look through it, you see all the brand stories, and then you jump onto their Instagram account to see if they're referencing the same thing. And so often these things are totally disconnected. And again, that shows brands that aren't thinking about how all their channels work together, and that sort of thing. Whether you're a consumer brand or a B2B brand, you know, you will be, you know, you want your spokespeople to be following, you know, key journalists on LinkedIn and putting out your thought leadership or your press releases or whatever it might be on their LinkedIn accounts at the same time that you're pitching that into media. So again, just none of that stuff requires a lot of resource. It just requires you to line it all up and to be thinking ahead of time with some of those things. So I think even just little simple multi-channel kind of tricks like that, I think can have quite a big impact as well.
Fantastic. Richard, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think for me, the audiences that we target, like I said earlier, we only deal with science, technology, and engineering companies. Normally, the technology companies are B2B technology companies. Not always, sometimes consumer tech, but normally B2B. So for me, the idea of having an audience as big as Gen Z, for instance, or an audience as big as Wales is insane. Like, I'd love that, but normally my audiences are 5,000 people spread around the entire world, you know? Let's find the 2,000 electronics design engineers that specify in this particular technology, and they'll be spread from Asia to the United States, sort of thing. So actually, one of the things that's really interesting is that small, not necessarily small B2B brands, sometimes they're global businesses, right? But B2B brands that have very small audiences like that are normally really good at making sure their messaging is really consistent across all of their channels. Because if you've only got 2,000 people to reach, you can't afford to have your LinkedIn account talking about different stuff to your media accounts, and you can't afford to have your Instagram account being just completely random stuff that, you know, doesn't tie in. So, you know, it's strange, isn't it? But actually, sometimes you can find the most sophisticated work being done in really places that you wouldn't expect. Actually, I think sometimes the proliferation of budget can actually be a negative thing, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I think one of the questions would be, from your own opinions, having worked outside of the UK, do you feel it is important to work with an agency on the ground in the country that you're working with? Would you suggest somebody from, for example, Nigeria, work directly for a brand in the UK, or to really seek counsel and work with an agency to push that product out?
Ask an agency if you should use an agency, and they'll tell you should use an agency.
Very true.
I think, look, it's not about agency or not agency. I think it's about having, I think still, despite the global nature of everything that we do, I think still having an advisor who has experience of the market is key. And I think you know, the UK is easier than others potentially because, as you say, you know, English, global language, etc., etc. It's probably maybe slightly easier to come into the UK than it would be to, you know, to go into a market where they speak a totally different language, and you know, that was very, very different. You know, so I think I can understand why people might sometimes think, you know, the UK might be an easier way to approach that. But we do have so much nuance, you know, despite kind of Richard's quick advice for how to speak properly to people in this market to not offend. You know, we've got massive nuances, we've got massive complexities, we're very multicultural. You know, you can get tripped up quite easily, I think, in this market by doing things in the wrong way. And you know, there are plenty of examples of brands that have done that. So I would say, whether it's an agency or not, I think having somebody that really understands the market, that can be there with you by your side, reading over media materials, you know, advising you on the right way to approach things, I think is really great. I think in terms of scale, if you're a big business and you're putting a lot of resource in, then I think an agency can be a really can give you good return on investment there. But it might just be that actually you just need a really great freelancer, or you need an ex-journalist that's worked in your sector that can kind of hold your hand through some of those things. So that would be my advice. But I think certainly if the UK is not a market you've had involvement in the past and you're looking to go into it, I would highly recommend at least having a solid kind of advisor that can be there to sort of help guide you through it.
Thank you, Danny. I see everybody nodding. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's probably based on two things as well, right? So absolutely everything that Danny said, and I completely agree. You know, if you ask an agency, we'll say use an agency. But I think my sort of two, variables would be the brief and budget. Ultimately, I guess some of those practicalities, because if you've got a really healthy budget, then you could engage another agency probably fairly easily and and have some real success. If your budget's limited, then you may have no option but to really kind of try it yourself and see how far you get. And then I guess with the brief side of things, it depends on, I guess, a spectrum of, is it a tick box? Do I just need to make sure that I've ticked off the UK market, or is actually the UK market potentially key to opening up other markets, and therefore I need tangible proof points to be able to evidence the impact of the work that we've done. And for me, those two things as well, in addition to what Danny said, would then end up whether or not you kind of go, we'll do it ourselves, we'll get a freelancer or a consultant who's based there who knows, or we need to fully engage a well-established, credible agency to help us deliver.
Amelia, just one question on that. Oh, sorry, just one question on that, Amelia. Very quickly. So you say with the brief to tick off the UK market. So my question for you is, can you have a brief that ticks off the UK market? And I say that in relation to a lot of our African members, for example, they will get a brief that ticks off the African market, which of course is 54, 55 countries, different languages, different cultures. So do you think it works to have a brief for a UK market, or do you think we need to do it down to the dissolved nations?
I mean, gosh, I would say, I guess in the space of Africa, that the ideal would be to address each of those 55 nations as their own independent nation, because of everything that we've talked about today, with like the cultural differences, different legislation and laws and so forth, to do a really kind of impactful and effective job. But I guess it sort of comes back to some of the topics that have been discussed in terms of authenticity as well, and that being is that a key brand sort of metric that, or is it the heart of the personality of the brand, whether that's consumer or in a B2B space? And, it might be that from a consumer perspective, it might be easier to kind of tick the UK market, whereas in Richard's space, you can't, because it's so limited, professionals that you really need to engage with, that you can't afford to just tick that or test it lightly.
Yeah, I think, that kind of relates to what I was going to say a little bit, actually, in that it very much depends on what you actually do. So if your product or service or the thing you are selling is something which is cross-border and international in its use, right? So this is going to be normally for B2B brands, but sometimes for B2C brands. So if your audience is has more in common with other people working in the same job than it does with other people living in the same country, then you can actually target more than one geographical region really easily with a campaign. And sometimes in those cases, it can actually be a drawback to have an agency in every country, because the agency in every country wants to do something completely different. They're convinced that their country is entirely unique, and quite often it isn't. You know, if you're you know, for me in my world of science, technology and engineering, if you're targeting electrical engineers, for instance, those electrical engineers in France have more in common with electrical engineers in Germany than they do with other people living in France, right? So actually the messaging is much more cross-border. And the same applies, you know, if we're targeting natural scientists or physicists or whatever it is across borders, they have more in common with other physicists than they do with other people in that country. So sometimes having an agency in every country can be a drawback. However, that doesn't take away from the point you made, Danny, which is that even if you don't have an agency in every country, even if you're using one agency to do the entire world, they still need to understand the country that they're targeting, because the journalists that you are dealing with are still in that country. So you might be targeting physicists, and those physicists may fundamentally respond to the same messaging irrespective of which country they're in. But the journalists through which you are targeting them still behave in a way that is more dependent on where they are geographically.
Fantastic. Well, I think
so the good news from that is that actually, if you are a business deciding whether to hire an agency, sometimes actually the best way can be the way that is also the most inexpensive.
Fantastic. So I'll go over to questions. There's one for you, Richard. So Richard, how important is it for tech companies to use social media?
I think it's that's a tough question, because tech companies is a huge range of businesses. So there are tech companies for whom a campaign without social media would be pointless. You know, if you're a consumer tech business, if you're a consumer-like tech business, you know, if you're in additive manufacturing or 3D printing or something like that, if you're in AI, then social media is going to be really important to you. It might be that the social media channels that are most important to you are the most conservative ones, LinkedIn, YouTube, that sort of thing. It might be that actually, you know, X and Facebook and Instagram and, you know, TikTok and stuff aren't very valuable. However, that's not necessarily the case. Like, if you look at some of the really niche tech industries, if you look at a really niche engineering industry, actually those people are often primarily visual. You know, those people, if you were trying to communicate with architects, well, you really wouldn't want to do that without using Instagram, because architects are primarily visual people, despite the fact that they have a huge amount of technical knowledge and a lot of detail that you probably want to communicate on LinkedIn. I don't think I've come across a campaign where I've gone, you know what, we just don't need to bother with social media at all. It's just about learning to fish where the fish are. You know, I've done campaigns that target very specifically practicing rheumatologists, and we've done it entirely through social media, and it works, but you just have to find out where those people are.
Fantastic.
And actually, I think to add, I'm not an expert in the tech space at all, but just remembering that social media can also work from an SEO perspective too, which, Danny, I'm sure you've got more to say on this. You know, it helps if you're thinking about your kind of your search engine rankings and things like that, having Facebook, like Instagram and X and so forth also rank and come through based on keywords and things like that, which you're trying to seed as part of your messaging to your audience, is also a consideration that I would probably suggest as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. And I think, you know, Richard's right. You know, not only can you bundle tech companies all together, you can't also bundle social media all together. You know, it's more complex than that. And ultimately, again, a lot of this will come down to how much resource do you have, how much, you know, and you're going to need to prioritize. You can't do everything, and that's true with every brand. And I think, yeah, again, it's about being very, very focused on what you want to achieve, who you want to get in front of, and then working out, you know, the best routes to be able to do that.
Fantastic. So I think we are now at the end of the session. We're just on time, which is unheard of. So I want to say thank you to Richard, Amelia, Danny and Josh for joining me today. This was a great conversation. I'm sure people will have taken it out. We have recorded the session, so we will edit that and we will put it in our newsletter, and we will also send it to anybody who registered today. So I hope to see you on the next session, which will be scheduled for the last week in March, on the heels of the PRCA Platinum Awards opening for entry, where I'll be joined with expert panel from across the world as we break down an award-winning entry. So watch out for the session booking on the international newsletter, and of course the Platinum Awards on our social media channels. So thank you everybody for joining me, and thank you again for the panel. It was great to have this conversation. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.